Welcome to IT Basics. Let's start with the single mental model that every help desk technician carries in their head. Every device you'll ever touch, a laptop, a server, a router, a phone, is built from just three layers. Hardware, the physical chips you can hold; firmware, the small code living inside that hardware; and software, everything else that runs on top. By the end of this lesson, when a ticket lands on your desk, you'll instinctively ask the same question the pros ask first. Is this a hardware problem or a software problem? Let's start with the layer you can actually touch: hardware. If it has a physical body, a chip, a cable, a button, a screen, it's hardware. Inside any computer, you'll find the same cast: the CPU doing the calculations, RAM as the fast short-term workspace, storage holding things long-term, and the motherboard tying it all together, plus the GPU, power supply, network card, and the peripherals on your desk. And here's the practical truth: when hardware fails, it fails physically. A capacitor pops, a fan dies, a drive crashes. No software update fixes that. You replace the part. Now, sitting just above the metal is firmware, tiny programs baked permanently into the hardware itself, teaching it how to behave. Your motherboard's BIOS or WUFI is firmware. It's what runs the moment you hit the power button, checks the hardware with a post, then hands control to the operating system. But it's everywhere. Your router, your printer, even your SSD and GPU have their own firmware quietly running the show. And here's why it matters on the help desk. When a device just becomes unresponsive, won't print, or dies out of nowhere, firmware is often the hidden culprit, and it's harder to fix because a bad update can brick the thing entirely. So let's lock this picture into your head: hardware on the bottom, firmware in the middle, software on top. And critically, each layer only talks to the one right next to it. Software doesn't touch hardware directly, it goes through firmware. And the boot sequence follows that same path every single time. Hardware powers on, firmware runs, firmware loads the OS, then your apps come alive. Memorize this stack, because almost every problem you'll ever troubleshoot lives at one of these three layers. Now let's zoom into that top layer: software. Software is just code, loaded from disk into RAM, executed by the CPU. And here's the thing: software has its own internal stack. At the bottom, drivers translate between the OS and hardware. The operating system, Windows, Mac OS, Linux, sits on top of that, managing everything. Frameworks like .NET or Python provide the engines apps run on. And finally, user apps, the browser, Word, the things you actually click. When any of this breaks, it fails logically. A bug, a crash, a freeze. The fix is restart, update, or reinstall. You never swap hardware for a software bug. So here's the mental model that ties it all together. When something breaks, you walk down the layers in order of cost. Start with software. Does restarting the app fix it? Restarting the whole machine? A reinstall? That's free and takes 5 minutes. If not, move to firmware. Does it even post? Try a power cycle, a BIOS reset, maybe a firmware update. Still broken? Now it's hardware, and that's where you're swapping parts and spending real money. Software first, hardware last. Every technician runs this flow, whether they realize it or not. Let's put that flow to work. 6 real help desk tickets. Read each one and call the layer before you peek. A laptop with no lights, no fan. Pure hardware, the power isn't even reaching the board. 3 beeps and no display. That's firmware talking. The BIOS ran post, found a fault, and is telling you in code. Outlook crashing on its own. Software, every other app works fine. Wi-Fi failing only on one device. Software again, config or driver. Grinding printer and random reboots. Both hardware, one mechanical, one likely thermal or power. Notice the pattern. The symptom tells you the layer, almost every time. Before we wrap this lesson, here's your reference card. 12 words you'll hear every single day on the job: post, BIOS, Wi-Fi, live at the firmware layer. Driver, OS, kernel. Boot and patch are software territory. Post, card, and ROM are hardware. And reflash and brick. Those are what happens when firmware updates go right. or very, very wrong. Don't memorize this in one sitting. Just know where to come back when a term shows up in a later lesson. Now let's talk about 5 mistakes that send junior techs chasing the wrong problem. Software bugs are not hardware bugs. A crashing app doesn't mean your CPU is dying. Firmware is technically software, but we treat it separately because bricking it turns your device into a paperweight. UEFI isn't just new BIOS, it brought bigger drives and secure boot, even if everyone still says BIOS. Drivers are software, not hardware. And bricked usually means corrupted firmware, not dead silicon, often recoverable with a USB tool. And that's lesson 1 in the bag. 3 layers, 1 mental model. Hardware is physical, firmware is the embedded code that wakes it up. Software runs on top. And when something breaks, you diagnose from software down to firmware down to hardware. In lesson 2, we go deeper into the hardware layer. CPU, RAM, and storage, what each one actually does, and why throwing more RAM at a slow PC isn't always the fix. See you there.